Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to our UC-wide Migration Center book series. I'm Erin Hamilton. I am an affiliate of the Global Migration Center at UC Davis, and I am so delighted to host our event today, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, and the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative at UC Berkeley. So today we are really lucky and happy to have Jennifer Van Hook and James Bachmeier presenting their book, Texas-Style Exclusion, Mexican Americans and the Legacy of Limited Opportunity. And to discuss the book, Sibel Fox, Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley. Jenny Van Hook is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Demography at Penn State University, as well as Non-Resident Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. And Jim Bachmeier is Associate Professor of Sociology at Temple University, a Founding Research Fellow of the Public Policy Lab at Temple University, and a Non-Resident Fellow as well at the Migration Policy Institute. And their book, Texas-Style Exclusion, is hot off the presses, Russell Sage Foundation Press, a really important, interesting book that I'm so excited to hear about today. We will take questions in the Q&A throughout the talk, so don't hesitate to, in the chat. So put your questions in there if you like, or at the end, after Sibel's discussant comments, we'll have the opportunity to open it up and raise hands. So with that said, I'm going to welcome Jenny and Jim, and thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I really welcome this opportunity to talk about our work over the last several decades. Jim and I both have sought to identify factors that support and hinder the successful integration of immigrants, and this just seems like such an important topic today, given that immigration is under attack, but it's also the only source of labor force growth for the country going forward. So it seems like a good time to take stock and think about what kinds of factors incorporate immigrants and which kinds of factors exclude them. So one group that scholars in the public have voiced concerns about are Mexican origin immigrants, and that they appear to be at especially high risk of experiencing discrimination, slow rates of assimilation, and less than successful integration. And so in this book that we're going to talk about today, we used census data that's linked, and it allows us to follow families over time, covering them from the time they first arrived during the early part of the 20th century across 8 decades and 3 generations. And we were also able to compare groups. And so we could compare Mexican immigrants with Italian families and other European origin groups. And so the big take-home point that we come to in the book is that families that settled in places that invested heavily in public schools, and that was mostly the upper Midwest as well as California, experienced much more rapid upward mobility than those who settled in Texas. So our overarching research question really concerns the prospects of integration for Mexican immigrants, and are they likely to follow the same pathways as did industrial era immigrants? And so the big question sort of circles around this issue of boundaries. Are the boundaries that circumscribe Mexican immigrants, is it more like an ethnic group, in which case the boundaries are more or less blurry and they can be crossed over time as they integrate into the social systems that make mobility possible in the nation? Or are they more like bright boundaries that circumscribe racialized minority groups? And the idea here is like racialized minority groups tend to encounter barriers to upward mobility and exclusion from the institutions that make mobility possible. And the short answer that we have in the book is that it really depends on where and when you look. So a lot of evidence points to racialization of Mexican Americans. And so this chart that I'm showing you here shows the percentage that did not complete high school on the left, or the percentage that went beyond high school on the right. And it's divided by generational status. And right here is what I'm showing you is a cross section of current population survey data that's sort of from the contemporary period. And so if you compare, here's the first generation with pretty high levels of less than a high school degree and pretty low levels of people going beyond high school. But if you compare that to the second generation, you see quite a lot of improvements and gains in educational attainment across generations. But then when you compare it to the third, there's really no change or difference between them and the second generation. And then finally, when you look at them compared to non-Hispanic white US born, you can just see how far behind they're falling in terms of going beyond high school. So many people have looked at patterns like this and been concerned. It's concerning that you see no improvements in beyond between the second and the third generation. And some might say something's wrong with American society and that Mexican immigrants are not being integrated into the third generation, and others might actually worry about the policies of bringing in low-skilled labor migrants and saying, well, maybe they're just not able to catch up fast enough. This came up, like, for example, Ross Douthat wrote in the New York Times more than 10 years ago, it's easy to see how third generation stall out could continue. And he kind of calls for a reconsideration of US immigration policy at that point. Making it even more difficult to address these problems is that Americans often have trouble understanding why Mexican Americans might seem to be slow at assimilating or integrating because of their own understanding of their own families' histories. And here we really talk about this idea of the success narrative. The success narrative is when these are the stories that families tell, and they've come to believe about their own family's success. And it's how they seem to understand, like, oh, we are an immigration nation. We're a nation of immigrants, and see how successful we've been. But how is it that then they come to see contemporary immigrants, and why would they want to close the door on them? So here's an example from the General Social Survey in 1994. The question posed is, the Irish, Italian, Jews, and many minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Today's immigrants should do the same without special favors. And at that point in time, 80% agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. I think that this is important to recognize that almost every white American family tends to tell these success stories. And I can tell you, in my own family, we have this sort of narrative that I grew up with. It was my great-grandparents immigrated from the Netherlands in the late 1800s. And my grandfather, I heard this story growing up a lot. He grew up in a very poor single-parent household where the children were expected to work at a very early age. And despite these challenges, my grandfather finished high school and then he worked on the line at a company called American Seating. It was a furniture company in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he eventually worked his way up within the company to become a vice president. And then he and my grandmother put all of their kids through college and beyond. So we hear this a lot. But what we don't hear, and what I failed to recognize as a kid growing up, is how much support those families in Michigan had growing up. He went to a high school that was actually one of the best funded school systems in the country. And there was all kinds of support at the company where my grandfather worked that actually supported immigrants and helped them get loans to go to, to buy homes and houses. And so these were very different environments than what other immigrants, for example, Mexican immigrants, might have encountered. And so this realization led us to think about a lot about how most people suffer from this sort of form of nearsightedness, where we tend to forget the support that European immigrants received and how much support others did not get, not just now, but also in the past. And so we sort of, that kind of comparison is something that tends to be lost in these understandings of what makes integration into American society possible. So to set the context for this study, it's important to recognize that the contemporary US population, its size and the ethnic diversity was formed in large part, at least today, by two major waves of immigration that occurred over the last 150 years. So industrial era immigrants arrived between 1880 and 1924, largely from European countries, but also included some new groups at the time, Southern and Eastern Europeans. Later, after the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, immigration increased again, but this time it was immigration originated mostly from Mexico, Latin America, and Asia. And today, a large share of whites can trace their ancestry back to that industrial era wave, while most Latinos and Asian families arrived in the country within the last 3 or 4 decades. One thing I want to point out on this chart is the little tip of red there at the top, like during the industrial era. So in reality, even though the most Mexican Americans can trace their ancestry to immigration that happened after 1965, there were a large number of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants who came to the United States during the industrial era, and those people formed they are the grandparents, great-grandparents of today's third or higher generation. And so this is a group that we really want to focus on today because these people grew up in a very different time period than the current contemporary Mexican immigrants did. So we organized the book around these two different eras in the 20th century. And so we kind of divided into, very crudely, into the pre-civil rights era and a post-civil rights era. And during both of those eras, there are what we identify as exclusionary contexts and inclusionary contexts for integration of immigrants. During the pre-civil rights era, a lot of the dividing lines were geographic. And so so we distinguish between like in Texas, there was a system of Jim Crow labor controls occurring during that time period, which really constrained the mobility of Mexican immigrants there. Whereas in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, as well as California, we typify as being more inclusionary in their approach to immigration and immigrant integration. During the post-civil rights era, this is a topic we get to later in the book. The dividing lines are less geographic and they're more along the lines of immigration status and the kinds of policies that were being enacted during that time that made school and school mobility within the educational system more possible. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Jim next and let him talk about our data and methods in the first couple of chapters in the book.
Yeah, thank you. And just wanted to echo Jenny in thanking the organizers, Aaron and Sibel for, and everyone for taking time out of their Friday afternoon to hear us talk about our book. To get into some of the more specifics, starting with the data and the methods, we rely on 3 different data sources to kind of tell the story of the book. The first data source, and really the workhorse data source that we use in the book, is a special data set that the Census Bureau created for us. And they did so by linking individuals in the 1940 census, as Jenny was describing, to census surveys later, specifically in the 1980s, and then again, more recently in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, to create this 80-year family longitudinal file that is really well suited and much better suited than most of the data sources we usually use to study immigrant integration, which is this, of course, this process that unfolds over time. And I'll describe a little bit more of that in detail, that data source. We also complemented the data with, we digitized a lot of data, historical data on school contexts. So this is really the precursor to the Common Core of education data. So going back to 1875, the federal government has published statistics on schools, and so we found these reports. They're usually large PDF files, and what we found valuable in those reports were data on schools. So data on enrollments, teachers and personnel, and then finances. And these were published in really long tables, and I can describe these data more in the Q&A if you're interested. But these were published in long PDF tables at the school district level. And that allowed us to create measures of school context in terms of funding and other characteristics of school agencies in local contexts. And we did so at the city, at the county, and at the state level. And then we also we rely on historical accounts that kind of help fill in the dynamics that are kind of driving the patterns in our data. As a kind of just an aside, I recall before we even started this project, I was reading a lot of this historical literature and found myself really going in circles. And I came across some of Professor Fox's work. And I think the word she used to describe the literature, at least for comparing across contexts, was hopelessly muddled. And I just found that so liberating, because it felt like, okay, I'm not the only one. And now I have some words to kind of describe this literature. And it really reinforced the need to bring some data to especially to some of these historical contexts. Okay, the data set that I mentioned, the census data set, I can unpack that a little bit more. We started again with the 1940 census, and so that was the complete count census. So every individual enumerated in that census, and we created families in the census, which consisted of anyone with a child living in the household. And we defined immigrant families as those with at least one immigrant parent. We matched these records using unique IDs that were created by the Census Bureau. And the first match was to current population surveys that were sampled mostly in the 1970s and 80s. And so we linked to the children of the 1940 families in the 70s and 80s. And then we link again to the third family generation. So these would be the grandchildren of the 1940 families in the 2000 census and in more recent American community surveys. We also organized our data into what we call vintages, and these became very important axes of kind of explanation and variation in integration patterns that we saw in the data. And a vintage is the objective of the concept is to kind of identify the starting point, the historical and contextual starting points of these immigrant families. And so what we call the early vintage is the 3-generation vintage. This is the one that begins in 1940. and consists of second generation children and third generation grandchildren who are adults today. The second vintage, the middle vintage, begins right after the civil rights. So these are immigrants arriving during or after the Civil Rights Act in the immediate decades following the Civil Rights Act, and their second generation children were born during the 1960s and 70s. So these are the first children kind of coming of age in the post-1965, post-civil rights era of immigration. And then finally, our late vintage consists of those arriving in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Their children were born in the 80s and 90s, and we're beginning to see their outcomes in these more recent ACS data. Jenny mentioned some of the strengths of these data and some of the groups that we can look at. We focused obviously on Mexican Americans, and we do a lot of comparison to the industrial era groups, specifically Italian Americans. There's a book by Joel Perlman called Italians Then and Mexicans Now that kind of builds on this idea of Italians being the quintessential labor migrant group of the industrial era compared to Mexican Americans of the post-industrial era. But I think we lose sight of the fact that though they weren't living in the same places necessarily, Mexican Americans were also an industrial era immigrant group in terms of the timing of the initial waves of their flows. And then we make comparisons, as a lot of immigration literature does, to mobility patterns of US born of African Americans and non-Hispanic whites. And we focus on educational attainment, years of schooling or completing high school or college, for I think fairly obvious reasons. Educational attainment is really expanding at this time in American history during the industrial era. As we'll show, it's expanding very unevenly, which is important for the research question here. And we view education as kind of a linchpin and an indicator of other forms of integration, whether it's home ownership or wealth or occupational attainment or anything like that. Very briefly, we analyzed all of these data in a federal statistical research center at Penn State and went through all the appropriate disclosures in releasing our results. Okay, so in terms of findings, I'm going to focus on parts 1 and 2, which focus on the industrial era period. And so I'll show some results from the data that show European immigrant success, and then data showing blocked opportunities for Mexican Americans, especially, as the title of the book suggests, in the state of Texas before the Civil Rights Act. And then I'll turn it back over to Jenny to talk about more recent patterns. Okay, so in terms of the story of the industrial era immigrants, and there are all these books by historians about how the different groups became white. And so we know that the story of industrial era immigrant integration, at least among the European immigrants, is one of kind of exceptional mobility, upward mobility, and integration into the mainstream of American middle class life. And so what we're showing is not necessarily new, but I think we have not always had very good data to actually study and observe these integration patterns. But we can see here in this graph, which shows the level of educational attainment measured in years of these different European groups in the industrial era by generation in comparison to native-born whites in the US at the time. And so that's the 0 line. And so we can see the Central Europeans, the Eastern Europeans, these are newer industrial era immigrant groups. There's the Southern Europeans down at the bottom. This includes the Italians. And these groups are starting out with major educational attainment disadvantages relative to whites in the first generation. And then we see this remarkable mobility where 3 of these European groups and the Eastern Europeans especially, they surpassed white average levels of attainment by the second generation, and by the third generation, all of these immigrant groups, that is their grandchildren and beyond, have exceeded what we might consider the mainstream or average national level of educational attainment. Sociologists know that we have a lot of explanations for explaining these sometimes paradoxical findings. We know that in many cases immigrants are highly selected into migration streams. There's a lot of sociology about the immigrant bargain and the high achievement kind of expectations that children growing up in immigrant families express. Recently, two economists, Abramitsky and Bustan, have focused on kind of immigrant success as being driven in part by the fact that immigrants are new and they're jumping into the opportunity structure at perhaps the most advantageous point, whereas longer-term residents may reside in an opportunity structure that provided more opportunities in the past than it does now. So there are a lot of different explanations for immigrant success. In our book, we really wanted to focus on the education contexts in these places where industrial era immigrants were concentrating. And also,
do you want me to go back?
No, that's
okay.
This is also a time in American history where, sorry, the progressive movement was especially influential. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten that mint before I started talking. But at this point in time, the progressive movement is influential in many places in the United States, not all. And a big prong of the progressive movement, especially when it came to immigrants, was the Americanization movement. And this movement is often characterized as sort of kind of top-down, what you might think of pressure cooker acculturation that really focused on kind of supplanting immigrant culture with American culture. But as this advertisement or this photo or this drawing shows, in the background you can see there's home, citizens papers, and school. Jenny, I hope you don't mind if I use the cedar as an example here. As Jenny was talking about, I come from kind of long distant immigrant background as well. Jenny's immigrant background is better for telling this story, but where Jenny's grandfather worked at had a magazine called The Cedar. And I think what's interesting and what captures some of the spirit of this era is that one thing that I found interesting about that magazine, which was the company magazine, is that they would report employees who had recently purchased homes. Jenny mentioned that they would often assist with the financing of homes. They reported on employees who received their citizenship papers, and they also reported on the scholastic achievements of immigrants and their children as well. So, and I think that captures perhaps a less focused on aspect of this Americanization effort that was prominent in many progressive areas where immigrants were concentrated. And that was some of the kind of the focus on structural integration and that was kind of funding. And I've read a lot of not just the historical kind of academic historical work on Americanization, but I also spent a lot of time reading kind of reports from school agencies, especially in California. And the Americanization movement was very just active. When you read some of the bureaucratic literature that was written a lot by teachers, And so the Americanizers, Jenny, if you could go to the next slide, they really focused on a couple of things. Compulsory schooling was a big focus of the Americanization program. More progressive states passed compulsory attendance laws much earlier than states, particularly those in the Jim Crow South. And so once compulsory schooling laws were in place, sociologists have found that there's kind of this bureaucratic development process that unfolds after that, where school funding decisions, the enforcement of compulsory schooling and child labor laws, these were all centralized. There were active night classes and civics classes offered to the immigrants themselves. And conversely, in the South, the southern states were far later to pass compulsory attendance laws. For example, Texas only passed their law in 1915. That was among the last states in the US to do it. I think California's law passed 1872 or something like that. Most of the states outside of the South had passed their compulsory attendance laws well before the turn of the 20th century. And this is important because these schools kind of had a head start in developing a school bureaucracy. And we can see that in this map here to the right, where states in the Northeast, and we can see California over there as well, received far more per capita funding. So in California and in New York, California funded they invested $164 per enrolled student. New York invested $169. These are $1930. Conversely, Texas at the same time invested only $67 per enrolled student. And in Georgia, I think Georgia was the lowest, which it was $39 per enrolled student. So there's massive amounts of variation in school funding at this time. And we think that this is an important part of the story. Okay. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Okay, in this graph, this is very similar to the one I just showed you, but this turns to the results for Mexicans. Again, these are unadjusted mean levels of schooling. And the zero line, again, is for US-born whites. And in the first generation Mexican Americans, we can see in this graph, we have Italians instead of Southern Europeans. But Mexicans and Italians in the first generation in 1940, they really start out with huge educational disadvantages, -4 years and about -5 years, respectively. And then the green dotted line, we see African Americans. I think it's important to point out, these are not immigrants. These are just African Americans residing in the country at the time, and then their children and grandchildren. And we can see the big difference in mobility, especially between the first and the second generation among Italians, and much more modest mobility first to second for African Americans and for Mexican Americans. And by the third generation, I'm sorry, by the third generation, this gap had still not been closed. There was over I think about a 1.5 year gap among Mexican Americans in the third generation. And I think it was about 3/4 of a year in schooling for African Americans. And so we return to a map, and we just saw the school funding map, and now we can see how these two immigrant groups are clustered really in different parts of the country. And knowing what we know about school funding at this time, they were clustered in very different opportunity contexts. Well over 50% of all second-generation Italians in 1940 were living in the states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. It's a very large group, and they did migrate to all parts of the country, 6% in California, 6% in Illinois. So these are pretty large ends if you're thinking about statistics. Conversely, Mexican Americans were concentrated just in primarily two states, Texas, of course, and California. These are two very, very different educational contexts. As I mentioned, we consulted a lot of the historical literature to try to kind of understand, what it was going on at the time that might explain these patterns. There's a great book by David Montejano. It's a great history of Mexican Americans in Texas. And during the Jim Crow era, he describes a population that was really ensnared in a Jim Crow era labor kind of recruitment or a labor control regime. Mexicans were really the only labor source in many parts of Texas. And growers and local elites really tried to keep that labor force in place so that they didn't, migrate elsewhere. And Mexicans in Texas were viewed primarily as workers, and so they really didn't receive much in the way of attention in schooling. When their schools were often segregated and very poorly funded. And we can see that in these quotes. These are quotes this is from Montejano. He was citing, there's a classic study by an economist named Paul Taylor, who was studying Mexican laborers in South Texas in the 1930s. And so this is even 20 years after Texas passed its compulsory attendance laws, and Taylor was encountering school superintendents who would not enforce compulsory attendance laws, in part because they would anger local elites who really controlled schooling decisions at that time.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and then so what are the consequences of this geographic kind of these differences in these groups and these different opportunity contexts? It is kind of hard, in part because there's not a lot of overlap between Mexican Americans and Italian Americans, but they were in the same places in sufficient numbers in some states. Of course, California, but also I think if you look at Illinois and Michigan, in these states, in this graph, which again shows just mean differences in educational attainment relative to whites, we see in Texas, now these are second generation Mexican Americans and Italians. So second generation Mexicans in Texas have a 4-year schooling gap relative to whites, which is obviously the largest gap we observed. In more progressive states, in states with better school funding, we see less inequality. There's still notable inequality in California, but the gaps are smaller, and they're much smaller, that is, comparing Mexicans at least to Italians, but also to whites. They're smaller in the more industrial states like Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. And then finally for me, and what we found, if we think of public schooling and public school investment as a leveler, in states like California with high public school expenditures, we found that the second generation attainment was less dependent on their parents' schooling than it was in places where school funding levels were lower. And so, in other words, this school funding really leveled out differences and disadvantages that Mexicans faced vis-a-vis other groups. That is, they were much better able to overcome their parents' lack of educational attainment in states with high school investments.
Okay, thanks, Jim. The last part of the book really kind of takes us forward to looking at these more recent vintages of immigrants from Mexico to test whether maybe things have improved. since the beginnings of the civil rights movement, which, you know, really arguably changed the landscape for access to schooling for many groups. And so what we really paid attention to, first of all, in the book, we kind of outline many of the social movements in the major Supreme Court and district federal court cases that took place starting as early as the 1940s for the Mexican American immigrant groups and carrying, of course, through to the 1980s. And actually, to be fair, even into the 80s and 90s in places like Texas. And a lot of this transpired and turned into eventually, although there was a lot of resistance, educational reforms in Texas during the late 1980s and 1990s. And then, of course, and I was living in Texas during this time, going to graduate school at University of Texas. And I remember when Ann Richards was governor, and then George W. Bush was elected soon after her. And both of these governors actually started implementing the equity-based approaches to education in the state. And then, of course, you know, George Bush took this approach in the form of his No Child Left Behind legislation. And a lot of these approaches were really seeking to incentivize schools to bring the kids' learning levels up to similar levels across groups. And one thing that was really important to some of these approaches, especially for children of Mexican immigrants, was that they did not exempt English language learners from these tests that were occurring in schools that held schools accountable for children's learning. And so this actually had a lot of impact, especially on educational outcomes for Latino students. And there's been some new statistical studies done to kind of show how this happened. And there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that these reforms made a difference specifically for children of Mexican immigrants. This chart just shows kind of where the funding went across time. And of course, what we're seeing here is reductions in variation across state as well as improvements over time. And you can kind of see this for California versus Texas. So when you look at those particular states, you do see a convergence and even a crossing, not really a crossing, but mostly a convergence starting in the 1990s or so. And so when we look at what does this mean then for adult educational attainments for these later vintages, here we're just mapping this out again for these data here for the early vintage are numbers that Jim just showed you and talked about. So this again shows the gap in schooling for that early vintage across generations, and you see how they don't close the gap even after the third generation. When we compare this with the middle vintage and then the late vintage, what we see is that in both cases, for both the middle and the late vintage, we don't have enough cases to follow through to the third generation yet. But when we just compare the second generation, we do see an improvement in terms of second generation outcomes. And we also see that even for these middle and late vintages, especially for the late vintage, we see a higher level of educational attainment, even compared to the third generation from the early vintage. And keep in mind, these are contemporary groups. So what this also kind of showcases is how when we start pulling apart these different vintages, we kind of see how that third generation delay pattern could have arisen in our contemporary data. So if you think about it, here's the first generation where my pointer is. The second generation outcome is way up here. And the third generation outcome is from that earlier vintage. And that's where you see the decline or delay in educational attainment. Here it is for different credentials. So this is a high school degree, post-secondary degree, and a college degree. And so for these early vintages, especially when we look at post-secondary and college degrees, we see the gaps between them and US-born whites grow across generations over time. But for these middle vintages and late vintages, we actually see not a convergence, but at least a narrowing of those differences, especially in high school and post-secondary. And up until recently, we haven't seen much progress on college, but there seems to be a little evidence of some closure of those gaps in college. It's not there yet, but it's there's a little hint there. So our main conclusions, I think I'll just wrap up now, is that opportunity for these immigrants really varied a lot by time and place. And when we looked at it in more detail, European origin immigrants, even those who started out with very, very low levels of education, were advantaged because they lived mostly in places with progressive educational systems and inclusive policies. Mexican immigrants were disadvantaged due to their subordination and exclusion. I think they were targeted as a group just specifically for a purpose of working in agriculture. And that impaired with the kinds of labor practices that were occurring in Texas at the time, placed them in, particularly vulnerable places with, and set them up for lower levels of upward mobility. And as we show in the book, these historical disadvantages carry through and across generations. So they tend to matter even today in the third generation. How do we think about the future? This has been particularly like a struggle for me and Jim, especially as we've seen, when we finished the book, it was before the election, right? And so now we talked a lot about how to write that last chapter in the book, and we can talk about this some more. But I think some of the things that we wrote about still stand today, in that there are a lot of structural changes that have occurred in the last century. So there has been improvement, especially in the 90s and 2000s, in opening up some of the opportunities in educational attainment for children of Mexican immigrants. We also know that we are living in an economy and a demographic sort of reality that tells us that immigration is really the only source of labor force growth in the coming years. And so I don't think the immigration issue, even though it's not a very popular solution, I think, on the right, there's a lot of talk about increasing fertility rates, but immigration really is the major source of labor force growth for the coming years. And I think it will continue to be an issue for maintaining the economy that people want to keep growing. The other thing I would like to kind of note, and we talk about this a lot in the book, is that advocacy groups are really working to make things more fair. Whether or not they're successful or not is something that I think requires additional thought and work. But we can't ignore the fact that it seems like we're backsliding. There's a lot of rhyming that's going on right now in terms of the current politics of polarization and anti-immigrant sentiment. The other thing that really I think is alarming is how immigration status itself is becoming a big dividing line in terms of who has opportunities and who doesn't. And there seems to be growing movements and mobilization to remove immigration statuses that are perhaps less precarious, and putting people back into those more precarious statuses again. And one last thing to think about is the rising costs of higher education. So in that sense, this presents yet another sort of barrier to people who don't have access to things like in-state tuition. And it's especially a big concern for this group. So with that, I think we will end by acknowledging our collaborators. We had a lot of students who helped us out with this project. We also work closely with a Census Bureau team. And then, of course, we've got funding from the Russell Sage Foundation, support from the U.S. Census Bureau, IPMS, and then our population research centers. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Jim, for that terrific talk and for sharing your book with us. And I want to remind the audience, as Cindy just put in the chat, that if you have questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat, although we will also open it up to questions but later. But first, I want to welcome Sibel Fox, who's professor of sociology at UC Berkeley and whose book, Three Worlds of Relief, addresses a similar sort of question related to the incorporation of different racial groups, including Mexicans, Blacks, and European immigrants in the US welfare system. And so I'm just so grateful to you, Sibel, for agreeing to take on this task and just for in advance for your, what I know will be really interesting comments. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Erin, and to the organizers, and to Jennifer and James for the opportunity to read and comment on this really important book. What makes it so important, I think, is the amazing new data that it brings to bear on questions that have animated a lot of scholarly research, but also public debate. And the data includes, as they mentioned, this longitudinal linked census data starting from the 1940 census full count, but also this biennial survey of education data that they spent 2 years, if I recall correctly, digitizing and cleaning to make it usable. So it's an incredible feat, but an amazing resource for scholars going forward. With this data, they're able to demonstrate, I think, convincingly that early vintage, and I don't love that term, but I'm going to use it, Mexicans, especially those who lived in Texas, faced structural racism that has had this long-lasting impact on the educational outcomes of their descendants. And that had they had the same educational opportunities that their Italian or European contemporaries had, they would not have faced this kind of third generation stagnation that we see today. And this is incredibly important contribution, not just to settle debates in the literature about the incorporation of immigrants, but also about kind of racial boundaries about around different groups, but also for kind of these broader debates, contemporary debates about immigration that we're facing today. So I highly encourage everyone to get this book. It's written in a very clear and accessible style. And I think it'll be really useful for undergrad and grad classes, as well as for the general public. It's really, it was easy to read.